Let's go on then. We want to discuss the Scottish Conservative Group Leader on Glasgow City Council, who is no longer the Scottish Conservative Group Leader for Glasgow City Council. Thomas Kerr has defected to Reform UK. He became the Tory Group Leader in 2019. He says that he's annoyed and angry with the Conservatives, and he's here to tell us more. Thomas, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Good to see you. Can I start, first of all, by asking, I read a report that you defected in the middle of a meeting. Is that how it happened?
It was indeed. In fairness, the timing was not within my gift. It was supposed to be after the meeting that this was supposed to happen. So the joys of politics, so it ended up like an episode of The Thick of It, where halfway through the meeting I seen Labour councillors look at me very smarmily, and then SNP councillors look very agitated, and I thought there's something going on here. And I looked at my phone to have messages from former colleagues saying, what the hell's happened? And I thought, oh God, here we go. So it had been released sooner than I had anticipated on yesterday morning. Right.
Released by the party, do you mean?
So it had been given to the press as an embargo that it was going out. But one of the journalists that got it hadn't been embargoed, and they could run it early, which then created chaos with everything else. So the joys of modern
honestly
politics.
Can't believe a political party press office cocking something up. I just simply don't believe it. I've never experienced this before.
I had to plan in my head as well. I could be up in my office away from all my other colleagues, not having to look at the eyes, and no, instead I got the whole shebang. So the joys of Glasgow City Chambers, sitting next to the Green Councils, I might say as well. So that was great fun.
I'm sure. Well, what was it like then, as you're sitting there and the news is leaking, basically, and you're among council colleagues? How do they start responding to you?
It was interesting. I mean, I think that there had been chatted in the chambers this week that something was going to happen. You know what politics is like, you know. So I think there was chatted in the chamber something was going to happen. I don't think anybody expected it to come quite as suddenly as it did. It was nervous, but then a lot of these people, I've been a councillor now for nearly 8 years, so a lot of these people I know, I count some of them as friends. Whether they count me as friends now, I don't know. But, you know, we've had coffees and things like that, so it wasn't that was nerve-wracking. It was more the idea that, you know, I'd been in the Conservative Party for 14 years, and knowing that this news had broke, I knew some of the reaction I was going to get from some of my former colleagues and things. That was more the nervousness that kicked in rather than actually around the committee chambers. And to be honest with you, I knew that the politics would kick in very quickly with the SNP and the Greens and Labour and all that sort of stuff. I don't blame them. I'd have done the exact same thing. That's politics, sadly. But yeah, it was more knowing that outside the city chambers, everything was going a bit chaotic.
Yeah. Sorry, just 2 seconds before I do, I just want to check that I've just been having a nice meal with my fiancée, and I had a glass of wine, and I just wanted to make sure, Thomas, that if I had it, that wouldn't cause any offence or any accusations of being unprofessional or anything, would it?
Absolutely not.
Thank you very much. Cheers. I'll just check.
I'm now a reform councillor. You can have as much alcohol as you like.
Thank you. I'm not worried about asking Andy and Calum's permission, but I just thought it'd be good to check with our guest. Look, you're going to get all these, these claims and accusations at you. I mean, I was very interested that in the 28th of June, or in the summer, I think it was last year, you said that Reform UK currently has candidates who are anti-monarchy, pro-independence, and apologists for Vladimir Putin. Be careful what you vote for, Scotland. So what's changed, Thomas? And are Reform UK still apologists for Vladimir Putin?
I think in fairness, I could have easily deleted every single social media post I'd ever made. I didn't want to do that because I wanted to make the point as well that, look, over the past year, Reform has remarkably professionalised. They have got themselves together. They have changed the party entirely. Would I have joined last June? Absolutely not. That wasn't the party that I would have joined at that time, but they have professionalised in a way that I didn't expect either. So under Nigel and under Zia, they've done a fantastic job in making sure the party is much more professional, much more slick. They can get rid of all this sort of stuff. They have a more clearer platform, so I feel a lot more comfortable. So yeah, at the time, the key word in that tweet is currently. At that point, they currently had that. I feel very confident that that's not the case anymore. And I think the other thing is, to anybody who's worried about it, I don't think anybody would ever doubt my unionist credentials or my support for the monarchy and that sort of stuff. I feel comfortable enough in myself to look at Reform and got to where I am now. So, you know, these things happen in politics. Last June, I was standing in the general election as a candidate for the Conservatives. You say stuff about other parties. I'm sure there's plenty of stuff that other people have said before they defected that came back to bite them.
Which leads to the follow-on question: have you actually confirmed or not if you're standing in Holyrood next year on the list for Reform, or even for a constituency for the Reform?
No,
UK
there's been I've seen all these accusations tossed about. There's been absolutely no conversations between me and Reform whatsoever about Holyrood in 2026, none whatsoever at all. I made this decision because I've been angry with the Conservative Party for a number of months now since the general election, really. I think that they've kind of left behind a lot of the communities that I'm elected to represent in the East End and things, and we've been told we have to go and focus in key seats and key areas and things like that. So I was angry for quite some time. I've not spoke to Reform about 2026. As I said before, we had a chat, I've got a 2-year-old son. I'll weigh up how I think things are next year before I make any decision. And I've seen all these sort of accusations, so I get it. But at the end of the day, if I was politically ambitious, I would not have joined the Conservative Party at age 14 in the East End of Glasgow. It is not a smart political move for me to do. I've done it because I care.
Well, let me say, I share your sympathy with having a 2-year-old, by the way. I know you're going through there. Would you like to stand up? I mean, if the opportunity arose, is it something that you'd like to consider for Holyrood in 2026?
I've stood for Holyrood twice now for the Conservatives, so I've got ambitions to go in there to do stuff. I'm in politics as a young person who cares about the communities that I came from. If I can make any sort of difference, wherever that is, of course I would like to do that. It doesn't mean I've had conversations. I've not made any decision on where I'm doing next year whatsoever. I may set the next election out. I'm still only 28, although I don't look at this as what Glasgow City Council does to you. But I'm still particularly quite young, so I've still got time on my side on what I want to do politically longer term. But of course, if I was to sit here and say to you, I don't want to be in politics and Holyrood, you would laugh at me because that's not the case whatsoever. But I have made no decisions whatsoever about what I'm going to do next year.
Thomas, you'll remember it must have been June, I guess, May or June, I chaired a Scottish Federation of Housing Associations panel in Glasgow that you were the Tory representative on. And, I think if anybody had been there that day listening to you on the panel and the others who were on the panel along with you, you sounded extremely mainstream. I would say you're a kind of, I guess a bit of a classic blue-collar West of Scotland Tory. And that's what I think you've probably always maybe been presented as. Whether you present yourself as that, I don't know, but I think you've always been presented as that. I think that there's an interesting potential development in Reform, and I just wonder what you think of it. I mean, do you consider Reform to be a mainstream political party? And you can take the word mainstream any way you want it, but is Reform mainstream?
Yes, I think they are. I think that what's happened, and it goes back to what I was saying about last June, I think what we've seen in the past years is Reform is becoming a much more mainstream centre-right political force in British politics. I think at some point they will likely be a serious threat to the Conservatives across the whole UK. They're already shown they're a serious threat to the Scottish Conservatives because they're offering something different now. I had plenty, there was a loads of conversations. I remember being the Holyrood Sources leadership hustings for the Scottish Conservatives. There was loads of conversations about what the Conservative Party should do. The reality is people in Scotland are fed up with this attitude of vote for us to stop someone else. That seems to be the only policy that the Conservatives have. And by the way, it's the only policy that Labour and the SNP have used as well, is vote for us to stop the Tories or vote for us to stop this and that. I think people out there want some sort of vision, and I think that's what Nigel Farage and Reform are offering, is some sort of positive vision as to what the country should look like. And I think they are becoming a much more mainstream party. They're much more to, the centre-right way of thinking. I wouldn't have joined them if I thought this was a fringe party full of loonies. It's not. This is a party that you're seeing as much more professional, much more slick, and knows what they're doing, and I think they can be a serious threat in Scottish politics to get us back to the things that I care passionately about, which is centre-right values.
So I tell you what's interesting, right? I heard you on Radio Scotland on Thursday night, and I had a little look at the transcript, and you said something I thought that was really interesting about Russell Finlay, because Russell Finlay, I think, has presented himself. I mean, there's the sort of common sense agenda, but Russell Finlay, in my book, has tried to move the Tories a bit further towards the Reform type of agenda, okay, to try to appeal to the kind of the person in the street who's been forgotten about by mainstream politicians and by centre-left governments. And I think that's where Russell Finlay is trying to head. You said the problem is the Scottish Conservative Party behind the scenes. Russell is not in charge. People who run the Scottish Conservative Party will not allow Russell to bring the changes that this country needs. I thought that was a really interesting comment. Do you think that Russell Finlay himself is nearer where you are and nearer where Reform is, but the establishment of the Scottish Tory party is not and isn't letting him go there? Is that what you're saying? Do you think Russell is a bit more like you and a bit more like Reform?
I think what Russell presents is definitely much more where I am and where Reform is now. I take Russell like he's at. I think Russell's a really nice guy, and I think he sells the right message. But as I said in that is in the BBC, the problem that Russell has is the people behind the Conservative Party will not allow the sort of changes that the party needs to then be able to take a vision out to the country. So I do think that Russell presents
So
himself
should
much
Russell
more.
join Reform as well? I mean, are you
He's more than welcome.
looking at a guy like Russell and thinking, why is he not in Reform?
He's more than welcome. I'm sure we would love to have Russell on board. But no, look, there's a serious point here, and it was frustrating me during the Conservative leadership contest because everybody was tinkering around what they wanted to actually say, which was there was a stitch-up that was going on in the leadership contest that existed in the Scottish Conservatives, and it existed for a long time in the Scottish Conservatives. So people who run the party and who ran the party for a long time who wanted to pick their candidates to do stuff. Russell was the latest candidate. Now, he's saying the right things, but I have no doubt in my mind that people who are behind the scenes are not going to let Russell be able to do the stuff he has to do. And if you see what's happened since he became leader, you can see that, he's a central belt MSP who spends a lot of time in the North East and in the borders pretending that he's a farmer. That sort of thing is not what we're going to do to appeal to the central belt. So I think that you're already seeing this party falling into the same traps as before. Focus in the North East, focus in the borders, stop in the F2, we can beat the SNP. And that rhetoric just won't cut it anymore.
I actually think there's a lot to be said for your analysis there. I mean, I'm not a Tory, so I'm not sure many people listen to me for my views on Conservative Party politics, but I actually think that last point is very important about the geographical focus and on the messaging, and it's something we've discussed on this podcast before. Can I ask then, Thomas, you mentioned you've been in the party 17 years, that's stalwart status despite your relatively young years. Are there others within the party feeling the same as you? And do you think there's going to be other defections in the run-up to 2026 from the Conservatives to Reform?
I would be surprised if there wasn't. I know there are people who are unhappy and who are angry. What I've said to every single person who's spoken to me over the past 48 hours since I made this decision, and I've had members, I've had councillors contact me, I've had even some MSPs contact me, and what I've said to them all is you have to get to that decision yourself, because it took me 3 months to get to where I am. As I said, I've been in the Conservative Party a long, long time. I grew up in the Conservative Party. It's like a second family to me. It's not a decision you take lightly, but I think there's also another paradox here. I don't think we're going to see just defections from Conservatives. I've spoke to a number of people who I'm close with in the Labour Party who are fed up and angry as well. I think that this is a movement that could really transform Scottish politics as well as British politics, and that's what's making me excited about it.
Yeah, I just want to say, because I think Calum had his New Year's resolution and prediction, and he said he thought that there would be in 2025 a Reform UK MSP. Now, we kind of poured a bit of scorn on him, meant to be the experts, Andy and I, and now I'm actually wetting myself that he's gone and called it right.
Andy's already predicted Russell, so there you go. We're one close.
That would be a huge one.
But serious question. I mean, did you think an MSP be it?
I don't know. I've spoken to MSPs, not about defecting. I've spoken to MSPs about the decision I have made, and they've been very supportive.
Wow.
I don't know is the honest answer, but do I think as time goes on and the Conservative Party starts to retreat back to the same old message that some people will say I've had enough, then yeah, I don't know what's going to happen. But as I said, I don't think this is just an issue for the Conservative Party. I think Anna Salwar has been extremely complacent about the issue that Reform's going to cause as a threat to him. I think other parties need to wake up to this. This is not just an issue for the Conservative Party. I'll give you an example. In the Glasgow North East by-election, which took place in November, Reform got 18% of the vote. Now, I remember one of the Labour councillors turned to me and said, what are you going to do about Reform leading into your vote? And I said, we never had 18% of the vote in Glasgow North East. This is not Conservative voters that are switching. 1 in 5 Green voters second preference Reform in that by-election. There is a phenomenon out there of people who are sick, fed up with the party system and who want something different, and Reform is offering that. So, yeah, there might be an MSP that could come from the Conservatives, but I would not rule out some other party jumping in here as well.
That's fascinating.
Just a brief point on that, and not to get too deep into the ideology because it's probably for another time, but I do think that the political bubble still looks at politics as being right and left. It's not anymore. Right? It's not anymore. Politics is now about, are they for me or are they not? And I think that's why you're seeing Reform being able to take votes from the Tory party and from Labour. It doesn't matter about right and left. It's about, have they forgotten about me? Are they interested in me? Have they got any idea what my life is like? So in the bubble, we're thinking about politics as being an ideological battle, but it isn't. Out on the streets, that's not what it is anymore. And I think that's where the mainstream parties are not getting what's going on here.
No, I agree with that analysis. I think that's bang on. I think it's easy for politicians, particularly in Holyrood, which becomes a bit of a bubble, where, it's good to have an ideological debate about left or right, but the reality is for many communities in the Central Belt and in Glasgow and other places across Scotland, they feel as if they're being left behind. They don't have the luxury of having a debate about ideology. They just feel as if their community has been torn apart. They've got politicians who promise stuff at elections and then don't deliver. They feel fed up and left behind. So they're not looking at right or left, they're looking at right or wrong and who they think is the right person that's going to stand up for them. And I think that's what Reform's tapping into, and I think it's really, really exciting for Scottish politics.
I think one thing that we've been working on, Thomas, in the last couple of months as we've been discussing Reform UK and their role in Scottish politics, this evolving role, is actually what they stand for, and to try to pin down a Reform UK policy of basically any kind. And I'm just wondering what you would hold up as the Reform UK policy that tipped your decision.
Well, you could look at the contract that they had last year, which was part of when I was spending time over Christmas looking at what I was planning on doing politically. Because over Christmas, I had the mindset I was leaving politics entirely because I was so scunnered with a whole lot of politicians. So I was leaving entirely until I started to look at Reform, having spoken to family and friends and other people. And when I looked at the contract from last summer, one of the policies that really stuck out was their economic argument, particularly through tax. This sort of stuff is the things that would actually help aspirational workers. Now, in terms of Scottish politics, they will have to evolve their manifesto. I'll tell you what was one of the turning points for me, though, was seeing at their conference, the speakers that they had on the stage were not politicians. They had people like Anne-Marie Ward from Favour UK speaking because they wanted to hear what her ideas were in terms of policy to deal with addiction. And that's what's exciting about Reform as well, is they want to listen to the experts and come up with a manifesto pledge and promise that actually works and has been delivered by experts. That's exciting as well. So, I think some of the economic arguments, I think some of the stuff on net zero is stuff that I fully back up on. If you look at Glasgow in particular with the low emission zone, too many politicians like to lecture people rather than actually...
So on net zero, Reform UK's take is the push for net zero is coming at the detriment of people, basically.
It's harming constituents like mine in the East End of Glasgow. We lost 400 taxi drivers last summer because of Glasgow's low emission zone, when that could have been delayed for a year to make sure those taxi drivers could have retrofitted cars, because politicians were too dogmatic to look at it in a pragmatic way. I'm not saying I don't back trying to tackle the climate emergency, I'm not saying this, but when you have these arbitrary targets put on stuff and say we have to make this, what you're doing is you're going to make the country poorer and you're going to make people poorer, and you're not bringing the public with you. You need to bring the public with you in all this stuff. And I think that's where politicians have got it completely backwards.
Mm-hmm. So if I may just tease out one thing before you go on, Calum, because on the net zero thing, I get criticised by some for being a defender of oil and gas, but I do that for pragmatic reasons, because I believe you need to protect the supply chain. And I get a bit concerned when I'm listening to some in Reform UK. I'm not sure if they're spokespeople or not, and this is the point about your infrastructure yet. I'm not really sure what relation they are to Reform UK. They certainly talk about Reform UK in favourable terms, saying, the wind doesn't work, we can't do that, that's a load of nonsense, a bit Donald Trump, the windmills when he work. I'm really concerned about that, because there is a massive economic opportunity in renewable energy, particularly in offshore wind, and linked to that green hydrogen. So I know, Thomas, you're new in the door, but are you going to be an advocate for ensuring that we do green industrialise our country, we do support the acceleration of offshore wind? I mean, I think that's important to understand.
Well, I think my job is to make sure that I can move Reform to a position where I think they can become a party that is serious about trying to open up economic prosperity. And if that's through green industry, if that's through other industries, and I'm happy to do that. Now, I'm happy to say, Geoff, unlike other politicians, I am not an expert when it comes to wind and when it comes to energy policy. It's not something we normally deal with in Glasgow, I must admit. I don't get many windmill or wind farm applications at planning committee. So it's not something I personally deal with quite a lot, but the exciting thing about Reform is that the policy platform is going to be created by people who are experts in the industry. And my hope is that would be from all different industries when it comes to the energy policy.
Yeah, but you do know that, I mean, look, Strathclyde University, great example, Professor Jim Macdonald. I mean, a lot of energy tech is going on, a lot of R&D is going on to support this. I think people think this is a North East issue or a Highlands issue. This is a potential transformation of our economy if we get this right. It has to be a managed transition, of course, but I really hope that if you're in a position of influence in 2026 or indeed in the general election thereafter, that we don't abandon that opportunity. I really hope we don't.
Well, as I say, I'm only 48 hours in the door. I don't have that much influence.
Well, I'm leaving it to you. It's on you, sort, okay?
Just a couple of final thoughts, Thomas. You've been very generous with your time. I want to ask whether you feel, or fear, perhaps a better word, whether you fear that you forfeited all power and influence on Glasgow City Council by becoming a Reform UK councillor by defection. You're off committees. We've already talked about the response from colleagues. Where does that leave your constituents?
I ever had any influence in Glasgow City Council.
You did. That
fills
you were
me with joy.
You were the Tory group leader. You were on committees.
But the reality was, I sat on committees because there was proportionality in terms of seats. We had 2 Conservative councils, so they sat us on seats. My vote was pretty meaningless because the SNP and Leeds have numbers to do whatever they want to do, and Labour couldn't vote with us because we're the big bad evil Tories with their attitude. So my influence is very limited to start with. Actually, what the SNP and the other parties have done is given me a bit of a free rein to go and spend a lot more time out of the city chambers and talking to the punters on the street, so I'm quite thankful for it. I think it's petty partisan politics, to be honest with you. I spent 8 years in these committees. I think I'm one of the longest serving. I sat on the City Administration Committee, which is the main body committee, from my very first day as a councillor up until last week when I was kicked off it. So they've kicked out someone who's got experience because they want to play politics. That's fine, that's politics. I'd have done the same thing if somebody had done the same thing. That's how it works. But I think that it's going to be their own detriment because I can spend a lot more time in shelters and talk to the punters and getting the Reform message out. And as I said to the press over the past couple of days, I am very confident I will be back on those committees with a much bigger Reform group, and politicians who try to silence me may have a bigger issue to deal with when there's a lot more councillors than just me there.
Really interesting. Thomas, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us.